You are listening to American Ambassadors Live, the podcast on international affairs sponsored by the Council of American Ambassadors in Washington, D.C. The Council is the association of non-career U.S. ambassadors who have represented America under presidents from John F. Kennedy through Donald Trump.
Hello, this is Ambassador Jim Rosapepe, your host today for American Ambassadors Live. Our guest today is the former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Christopher Landau, who served from 2019 to January of 2021. Prior to his ambassadorship, he practiced law in Washington with the firm of Kirkland & Ellis, and also served before that as law clerk to two U.S. Supreme Court justices, Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas. Ambassador, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be with you.
The United States has a lot of stuff to do with Mexico.
That is totally true. It was never a dull moment in that job.
I can imagine. But let's start with something the whole world has in common, which is the COVID virus crisis. You were there, obviously, as ambassador when it took off, and obviously you're following and continuing following what's going on there. It's been different in different countries. Some places have done better and some places have done worse. How did Mexico deal with the crisis?
It was a real challenge there, as in many other countries around the globe. You know, the crisis kind of snuck up on Mexico, as a lot of places, and hit pretty suddenly in March of 2020. We've been hearing reports for a couple of months about, this mysterious virus in China. And I remember very vividly that the Mexican foreign minister reached out to me to see if the U.S. could help in any way to evacuate some Mexican students who were studying in Wuhan and were trapped there, and tried to help him out with that. But it was very difficult because all of the seats on the flights that we were arranging were taken by American students. That was in January of 2020. And then things kind of went along in February. We were kind of hearing about it spreading in Europe. And then all of a sudden in early March, it hit like a thunderclap in Mexico. The first cases actually tended to be in pretty high net worth individuals who were international travelers. There was a cluster that were in Vail, Colorado for skiing and came back. And so, in that first week in March, I started to get a little bit nervous. I had some pretty big appearances as ambassador at receptions. And I remember very well, I was going to one, and my Israeli colleague called me when I was in my car on the way over and said he regretted, but his foreign ministry had told him to stop going to public events. So I thought, well, maybe this is my last public event too. But it was a little bit unnerving because I was in a room of about 400 people.
Wow.
Frequent travelers and such. And then basically there was a long weekend in Mexico in mid-March. My family and I went out of town because we kind of figured it might be the last time. At this point, there was only about 10 cases or so in the entire country of Mexico that had been reported. So it was still something, pretty abstract at that point for us and for most people. But I remember we got back to the embassy that Tuesday morning after that long weekend, and I think that's when Washington was starting to close down, and we made decisions to start closing down the embassy as well, and in fact did as of the next day, and went to a skeletal emergency staff. It really didn't hit Mexico that hard until a few months later, frankly. It was behind the United States. Most of the cases came from the United States. It was, a challenge for us to make sure that our common border was under control. And I think Canada really wanted to close its border with the United States. And we figured we had to do whatever we did on the Canadian border, we should do on the Mexican border. So we went in and we kept the Mexican border open to commerce, which was very important economically for both countries.
And did that stay the case throughout the entire crisis? It was open?
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. That border never closed to commerce and trucks. So in a sense, when people say, well, you close the border, I think it's always important to say no. In fact, we kept the border open for some critically important purposes. I think a lot of Americans don't realize this, but Mexico is one of our largest trading partners. In fact, in some periods, it's even been the largest in the world.
Mhm.
And the estimates are that the US would go into recession within 6 days if the Mexican border were closed to commerce, just because so many goods and services flow across that border. So we kept the border open for commerce, but we closed it for non-essential
Understand.
travel, which is
That contra-
basically, tourism.
Was keeping it open for commerce controversial, or just people, it seemed commonsensical to everybody, or was it controversial?
Yeah, I think it was pretty commonsensical. I mean, I think at that point we didn't know that much about the virus, and I think it seemed like that would be a pretty extreme step to take at first. I suspect if the virus had turned out to be more lethal, the countries really would have had to be cordoned off. It's interesting because Mexico had a big outbreak of H1N1 virus about 10 years ago, and their leaders had developed some pretty strong views about infectious disease strategies. And one of them was that border restrictions don't work in their view. And so I remember I contacted them about, flights, and they refused to cancel or curtail any flights from anywhere in the world from the very beginning of the crisis until through the very end.
And what was their argument? I mean, lots of other countries did the
They
reverse.
just said that those things don't work. The virus is out there anyway, and there's no way to stop it. And so there's no sense in curtailing travel. Mexico is one of the very few countries in the world that I'm aware of. In fact, it's the only one I'm aware of that imposed absolutely no restrictions on international airline travel. And, I think they, agreed to restrict non-essential traffic at the land border just because I think they understood that the land border involves a lot more people crossing every day. It's just a much greater volume. But the truth is the Mexicans never really enforced that restriction on their side of the border. So that caused a lot of hard feelings in Mexico because people would say, well, wait a second, we Mexicans can't go into the United States across the land border, but Americans are free to come to Mexico. And they said, well, how's that fair? And I said, look, the agreement is reciprocal. That's all I can say. And,
why didn't the Mexicans enforce that?
Again, I think it's this allergy they have to enforcing border restrictions. I think for many years, as you know, they've been a country of migrants, and I think they have a very strong commitment to keeping borders open.
I see. So it's more part of a long-term strategy, not particularly related to COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, this was one of the lessons that they purported to have learned from the H1N1 crisis. And again, I was very surprised, frankly, because I don't purport to be a scientist, but that seemed counterintuitive to me, and it was certainly not the way other countries were handling it. But Mexico is a sovereign country, and they can make their own decision. Fortunately, there were no flights from China to Mexico. There had been one to Tijuana at some point in previous years, but that had been already suspended before COVID even hit. So I started to get some phone calls from Washington, like, gee, we don't want people flying from China to Mexico and then coming over to the U.S. So it wound up hitting Mexico at somewhat different stages than other countries, but already pretty much in earnest. It started to spread last spring and summer. I'd say it's about 3 weeks to a month behind the United States, just in terms of the number of cases and the various peaks.
Did the situation with the hospitals get to the crisis points that it did in other countries?
It did in some parts of the country. I would say it never reached a point where we were saying basically the hospital system is broken in any locality in Mexico. They came close a number of times. I mean, they were stretched very thin, and they set up a lot of temporary hospitals. Obviously, it got very complicated because a lot of general purpose hospitals got turned over to COVID exclusive use.
Right.
And so it put strains on the rest of the medical system as well, which was never, hugely robust in Mexico. So, I think one of the problems in Mexico from the outset was that they really did not do much testing. Again, I think it's somewhat in contrast to other countries. They kind of had the view that, well, what good does testing do? Because you either have it or you don't have it. And so what that did is that made the statistics very difficult to understand. I mean, look at the newspapers, it had about a 10% mortality rate, but I never believed that because, of course, the people who were being tested were people who were already showing up at the hospitals. There was no kind of general randomized testing, which made the whole venture very difficult to be assessing, what the real impact was.
That's fair. I mean, such a different approach.
It was very different. And also the government from the beginning, the federal government refused to create a stimulus program. So as economic activity basically slammed shut at the end of March of 2020, I think it was the last day of March, the federal government put out an order that only essential businesses were allowed to operate, which in Mexico was actually construed very narrowly to be, basically health, food production, and transportation. And that was it.
A big shutdown.
So, and that got to be a very complicated thing in our relationship with Mexico because we obviously have very integrated supply chains. And there was a number of industries that were allowed to operate in the United States that, required and depended upon components from Mexico that were not forthcoming.
So thinking about it in the trade context, there was commerce across the border, so things could come to the United States from Mexico, but stuff couldn't be produced in Mexico.
That's right.
Carry cross the border. That's interesting.
It got, again, food could continue to come, but normal,
industrial equipment,
production of auto parts and stuff was shut down. And that was great at the beginning because the U.S. auto industry was shut down for a while, but it got to be very complicated when the U.S. started to reopen in the summer, and that required a lot of finagling to try to keep those supply chains alive, which is ultimately the interest of both countries.
Indeed. Now let's fast forward. Where are they now with vaccinations?
They have been scrambling to get vaccines from all over the world. And so, they have, they've purchased a number on the open market. Other governments have been, providing them with vaccines. So they have, the Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, the Chinese and the Russian vaccines. So they're really using a lot of different vaccines. And I would say that the vaccine program there is, again, maybe a month or two behind the United States. So I was just in Mexico last week. They started vaccinating people, in certain priority categories, as in many places, certain essential workers first, and then, older people by decade. So, started with people in their, 70 and above, and then it went to people in the 60s, the 50s, the 40s. I think right now they're either already getting to the 30s or they're about to.
Gotcha.
And, it's just proceeding in different phases. So it's moving along. Mexicans of greater means who have the ability to do it are mostly flying to the United States and getting vaccinated here because there's very few restrictions on proving where you're from. I mean, basically, you walk up and they'll give you a jab in the arm.
Do they have the same thing with people coming from other countries in Central America to Mexico to get vaccinated, or are those people who can do it just coming to the United States?
I think the people are just going to the United States. I'm not aware of any people going to Mexico for this. Again, vaccines are still not nearly as plentiful there as they have been in the United States.
I understand. We touched on trade and the impact of COVID on it. I want to switch to the longer term trade issue, which is the NAFTA agreement, which has been in effect for many years. But one of President Trump's priorities was renegotiating it, and it has been renegotiated. Be interesting to understand from your perspective particularly, what were the politics of that in Mexico? Did Mexico want to renegotiate it, and what did they want? What was working for them? What wasn't working for them?
Well, it's complicated as it is in the United States. I mean, I think NAFTA marked a sea change in the US-Mexico relationship. I would say not only economically, but really across the board. That I think for the first time, Mexicans, I think really across the board, began to view the United States as really their partner and on the same team as them, and not as a country that with which they've had historical differences. And so there was a kind of a change of mentality, and also it was a period of dislocation in Mexico as it was in the United States. I mean, just as that kind of free trade regime creates winners and losers. Some sectors do super well. Other sectors really are faced with new competition. And so by the time I got there, NAFTA had been in effect for about 25 years, and that had all kind of shaken out already. There are people. The president of Mexico, President López Obrador, like President Trump, had been a skeptic of the free trade regime. Again, I think both of them are fairly nationalistic leaders, and saw this agreement, or just weren't necessarily inclined to this kind of agreement. So in a sense, I think it's quite a tribute that, notwithstanding the politics and the skepticism of presidents on both sides of the border, the agreement was renegotiated and signed. And the truth is, I think it was pretty uncontroversial at the end of the day that NAFTA needed some tweaking after 25 years. And so the question was really, what's going to be the degree of that? How you define tweaking.
What were the issues from Mexico's point of view? What did they want to have changed?
Well, I think everybody acknowledged that you needed to be able to deal with intellectual property and some of the new technologies that have emerged since NAFTA came into effect in the early 90s. I think there were, I think frankly, if you had left it up to the Mexicans, they probably wouldn't have, wanted to change it. But, that wasn't really an option, because President Trump was absolutely adamant about this. This was a major part of his campaign in 2016. And so I think, the focus was always, let's try to improve this as much as we can and make it fair all around. So there was, I think we have a common interest in making sure that China can't take advantage of loopholes. And so there are, provisions about how many, what percentage of a car, let's say, has to be made in North America. So, you can't be smuggling in parts from China and that kind of thing.
And that's new?
Yes. Those are new requirements. Also, the new agreement covers areas, particularly labor, that were not covered by the original NAFTA. And I think that was one of the big complaints on the U.S. side of the border, that it was kind of unfair for U.S. companies to compete against business in Mexico, where wages are much lower and where workers' rights are not protected to the same, or were not protected to the same extent. Mexico passed some pretty sweeping changes in its domestic labor code, raised its minimum wage quite substantially. Wages in Mexico had fallen beneath those in China. So it really was a very low wage country. Yeah, a lot of people are surprised by that. So I think there was a view in Mexico that it was okay to make these changes. I think it remains to be seen how that will all play out, because now the new labor laws in Mexico are part of their domestic law, but they're also part of this treaty obligation. And I think that could be quite an irritant in bilateral relations going forward, to kind of monitor compliance with that obligation. But
were there changes?
Sorry.
Were there changes in the compliance regime, or are they pretty much the same?
No, there were changes in the compliance regime too that really put some teeth into the compliance regime. And so there's a process for basically, one party or a party to, file an arbitration request, and, even based on one particular occurrence at one factory. So it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to rise to the level of saying, you are nationally not enforcing your labor laws appropriately aligned collective bargaining. It can actually be as granular as saying, at this particular plant in this particular place, the workers, were not allowed to receive union literature, or, the voting was not fair. And, again, I think this is going to be complicated, particularly as we figure out how the international enforcement mechanism coexists with the domestic Mexican enforcement mechanism. I don't think it's necessarily great to have everybody run in the first instance to an international tribunal on any and every labor dispute in the country of Mexico. And so I think that's going to be, an ongoing challenge to come up with standards for what kind of rises to the level where the United States of America, as a signatory party, would take up a case. Unfortunately, I'd hope to be involved in the initial cases under that as ambassador, but that was not to be.
I understand. What were the politics of the renegotiation in Mexico? I presume the workers who got wage increases liked it, and some of the companies who were making the wage increases didn't like it, or was it?
Yeah, I'd say in general, though, it was not terribly controversial in Mexico, because I think, as you said, the companies that were not particularly inclined to like some of the changes understood at the same time that the alternative was really, was not to stay with things, the status quo with NAFTA, but really to wind up with no agreement with the United States. That, it was, that there really wasn't an option to continue. And I think, those people, the business community in Mexico, I think views the free trade relationship with the United States as a major competitive advantage, kind of in the big picture. So I think they were willing to absorb some pain and things they didn't like at, let's say, a more micro level, to preserve the overall framework of a free trade relationship. So, I think, they were very worried. I mean, when Trump was elected, the Mexican peso fell terribly. And I think there was just a lot of concern about Mexico's economic future in a non-free trade world. So I think they were just grateful to, that basically there was an agreement. So it was, it passed the Mexican legislature almost unanimously. And interestingly, in the United States, it passed both the Senate and the House. It's interesting because it's not just a classic treaty that only goes to the Senate, but it also required domestic implementing legislation in the United States. So it had to go through both houses of Congress, which obviously made it complicated because by the time this thing was being finalized, the Democrats were in control of the House, and the Republicans, the Senate, and the White House. So it really had to have support across the aisle in the United States. And it ultimately did. It passed by about 90% affirmative votes in both the House and the Senate. It was about 90-10 split in both bodies. So, which is a big contrast to what NAFTA was 25 years ago. I mean, NAFTA got through by the skin of its teeth back in the day.
So on that bilateral bipartisan note, I think we're going to wrap up this discussion. Very, very interesting. Ambassador Landau, thanks for joining us today.
It was a real pleasure, Jim. The relationship between the U.S. and Mexico is so important. And I think probably more than any other international relationship, it really affects the everyday lives and the prosperity and security of each of the two countries. So it's just a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you about this. And I hope this is interesting for your listeners.
Thanks an awful lot.
This has been the American Ambassadors Live podcast. To hear more from us, subscribe to the American Ambassadors Live podcast and leave us a review. Tweet us your thoughts on this week's episode and tag us at AMER Ambassadors using the hashtag AmbassadorsLive.